I'm live. Okay, we are at part 2 of the book Time Out of Mind, which is the autobiography of Joan Marshall Grant, who was a writer of farm memory books, and she explains the concept of reincarnation and farm memories in this book. She wrote Winged Pharaoh and Life as Corolla, books I have read aloud. So I have read this before. I have a very old copy, and I love it. We are at chapter 2. She was born in 1906. Chapter 1 of the second part of this book, Intimations of Mortality. Iris had been officially engaged to Ronald Kershaw since she was 18, but as he was in the RAF, Mother did not consider him a good match, and so she had to wait to marry him until she was 21. I enjoyed being her bridesmaid. The wedding was from Emily Grigsby's house in Brook Street, but now she had gone, I should have been more lonely than usual if the Workman family had not come to live in Hayling. I was very fond of them all, although Kirstine, who was 3 years older than me, and Tommy, who was my contemporary, were my special allies. Kirsten was at boarding school in Scotland and seemed to like it there, but I had no intention of going to one again, so I jumped at the suggestion that I should have lessons with Mr. Lewis. He was a crammer, and until Mother bullied him into taking me, his pupils were all boys. She did it, I think, to give herself a breather from mademoiselles and governesses. There were 8 boys of 13 or 14, being forcibly fed with information after having failed to get into public school through the front door, and 4 older ones who were trying to pass into Sandhurst. At first the younger ones bullied and the older ignored me, so after about a fortnight I decided to do something about it. Dividers fixed to the forearm with 2 strong plastic bands, leaving the spikes protruding half an inch beyond the point of the elbow were a stroke of genius. The spikes were concealed by my jersey, but a sharp nudge brought a startled yelp from an offending neighbour. It would have not been fair to let them suffer more than a cold glance or biting sarcasm from Mr. Lewis, so when danger from that quarter threatened, I would stare wide-eyed at my victim and say, "I think poor Derek or Cecil or Valentine has been stung by a wasp," and produce in evidence a dead one which I had tucked under the leg elastic of my bloomers. I tried different tactics on the older boys, and managed to make 2 of them believe that I had been cruelly bullied by the other, and so enticed them into fighting a duel. At least it was a duel in my imagination, though it was only a fist fight behind the shrubbery, which ended in one of them getting a black eye and the other a nosebleed. For 2 happy days my rival champions vied with each other to do my prep for me, but on the 3rd morning I found they had been caddish enough to compare notes and were bent on revenge. "We shall catch you on your way home and give you a thrashing, you little beast," they hissed at me during 11s. Probably they only intended to give me the fright I deserved, but I believed I was in danger of something close to murder. It might even be murder. If so, as I gloomily decided during that interminable afternoon's lesson, it would be little satisfaction to know that they would hang, even if I were waiting at the bottom of the drop. I achieved a 50-yard start by climbing out of the cloakroom window and over the garden wall, but they were lurking by the gate and saw me before I turned the corner. Terror gave me a turn of speed, but I knew I would never keep it up until I reached the haven of the back gate into Seacourt, so I dodged into a nursery garden and hid in a cucumber frame. Luckily, there were plenty of leaves on the plants and the glass was whitewashed, so they never found me, although I heard them prowling around and muttering dire threats like Mr. McGregor after Peter Rabbit. For the next week I had to pretend to have a strained ankle so that Wilson could drive me back and forth to school. Then the other 2 bigger boys took pity on me and provided a bicycle escort. Mr. Lewis, who for a long time had been crippled by arthritis, gave up taking pupils at the end of the year. So once again I had a series of governesses, tired old women who had forgotten how to teach but were no trouble in the house and looked after the linen. Then in January 1921, Father went to Poole to play tennis and took Mother and me with him. Poole. He only intended to stay a fortnight, but developed a virulent type of local flu, and so eventually we stayed there nearly 3 months. The mademoiselle hired to take me for walks was sad and spotty, but the days were enlivened by playing jeu de paume with a young Basque pro on whom I secretly dotted, and being flattered by elderly Frenchmen who, never having seen a female play the game, used to make congratulatory noises from the dead-uns and give me bunches of carnations. Mother suddenly remembered that when, 4 years earlier, Iris had nearly died from blood poisoning after pricking her thumb on a rose bush, she had recovered after 3 operations when Sister Arsène sent her a bottle of holy water from the grotto at Lourdes. It now seemed clear to Mother that Father's illness was due to she and Iris having failed to make a pilgrimage of gratitude to Lourdes. To her it did not seem at all illogical that God would vent his annoyance with them on Father, so Iris was sent for and came reluctantly because she had to leave poor Ronald all alone at Colshot. I was eager to go to Lourdes, for I believed then, as I do now, even more strongly, in miracles and hoped to see one happen. But Lourdes was a bitter disappointment. It poured with rain, and Iris' shoes were so wet that Mother insisted on stopping on the way to the church to buy her a dry pair, which were a size too small and of very ugly patent leather. Father, who was always acutely embarrassed in any religious building, peered dutifully at the votive offerings on the walls and tried to pretend he was only in a museum. The grotto itself was even more depressing. 2 very grimy old women were washing their ulcerated sores in the pool, and from it another was filling a medicine bottle. The hanging crutches clattered in the cheerless wind. So few crutches for all the thousands upon thousands of faithful who had been there. I hope people have the sense to boil the water before they drink it, muttered Father fretfully. Or it really will be a miracle if they don't catch others' diseases. Some have been cured here, I whispered back, or there wouldn't be any crutches. God, if he exists at all, which I very much doubt, as must any sane man who considers the appalling cruelty and misery which exists in the world, must be ubiquitous, said Father. He is, but people don't believe it. They have to have labels for everything before it is real to them. They want everything real to be solid, and it never is. My voice trailed away into the silence, broken only by a party of monks with sad, pinched faces, rattling the beads of their rosaries. It was a very lonely day. On the way back to England, we spent a fortnight in Paris, where Mother had laryngitis, and Father nearly walked me off my feet round museums. The evenings were much gayer, as he felt that after the bread and butter of culture I had earned the cake of royal bergères, or the Moulin Rouge, instead of finishing the day at the opera or the Comédie Française. Trying to make myself look less like a schoolgirl, I bought myself a lipstick and used it lavishly, which Father let me do so as long as I wiped it off before we went back to the hotel. The lipstick proved to be an error, for I put it on when Mother reluctantly let me go alone to look at shop windows in Rue Saint-Honoré and the Rue de Ravioli when Father was busy. Rivoli, Rue de Rivoli. Frenchmen have such nice manners, I said cheerfully at luncheon. It only pleases them when someone else looks happy. How do you know? Inquired Mother suspiciously. Because when I smile at them, they smile back, and 6 times this morning I have been called un joli petit fille de joie, a daughter of joy. Isn't that a nice way of saying so glad you're happy? Mother pursed her lips and frowned at Father, who went red with suppressed laughter. It is not at all funny, Jax, he said severely. What's the joke? I asked anxiously, but they did not tell me, and it was a long time before I ceased to resent the paternal decision that I was not to go out alone again in Paris. Father had threatened me as an equal even when I was a small child, but now he did me the honor of keeping me with him when the women went to the drawing-room after dinner. If there were no visitors, we played chess, to be praised if I managed to win 1 game in 5, to be called a boiled owl if I missed an obvious move. He was delighted when I could visualize the game well enough to play it without looking at the board. A lot of the conversation to which I listened while the men drank their port was over my head, But as I had a photographic memory for dialogue, fragments of many subjects gradually fitted together and formed a wide, if not somewhat chaotic pattern. The square root of -1, the prospects of splitting the atom, sociology, developments in physics, and medical techniques, to all these I listened absorbedly, for as they were of interest to father, they were of enormous importance to me. A source of knowledge which, if I could only acquire it, would make him as proud of me as though I had been his son. Sir Richard Gregory, F.R.S., the editor of Nature, a lifelong friend of H.G. Wells, Sir Theodore Cook, editor of The Field with one blind eye, and a rich fund of good stories. C.G. Lamb, professor of engineering at Cambridge, whom I loved more than all the others. Tommy Horder, later to become Lord Horder, the royal physician, who said to me, "Never believe blindly in doctors, Joan, but use your critical faculty. I am the greatest diagnostician in England, and hundreds of my diagnoses are wrong." To them all, and to many others amongst my father's friends, I shall always be grateful that they talked and let me listen, and never seemed to mind my being there. The only one with whom I did not have to pretend to be a boy or an embryo scientist was Mr. Lamb. He had never seen a ghost, but physical research was a hobby nearly as dear to him as collecting rare beetles. He had been a friend of Jenny's and told me that if my grandfather had let her become a concert pianist, she would have been world famous. "Jenny gives me music lessons," I said, suddenly no longer shy to talk about it. "Father knows I would never be a first-class pianist, so there's no point in my having lessons. But Jenny knows I need music, and she teaches me. Sometimes she plays the piano with me, music that is quite different to the ordinary tunes I've learned." As I was speaking, I knew that Jenny was in the room with us, so I went to her piano. Music, strong, passionate music, flowed out of my hands. With the last crashing chord she left me. Mr. Lamb looked pale and mopped his forehead. "Extraordinary," he said, "quite extraordinary, but completely evidential. Do you know—" "No, of course you don't. How would you? That what you have just played was often played to me by your grandmother. I have not heard it since she died." "Perhaps I heard it at one of Mr. Walkman's concerts. She often has pianists staying at Gothic Lodge." That you most certainly did not do. Only one copy of that music ever existed. It was given in manuscript to the Tsar of Russia, who sent it to your grandmother. I have a very accurate ear, although I play the piano not as a musician, but as a mathematician operating the pianola. Then I must have heard Jenny play it when I was a baby, and remembered it. Babies remember far more than grown-ups give them credit for. He took out his tobacco pouch and carefully rolled a cigarette before answering. His hands were shaking, and he spilled shreds of tobacco on his black alpaca jacket. Infantile memory would be the logical explanation, if, in this instance, it were possible to take refuge in logic. However, I happen to know that the manuscript of that music, together with several other manuscripts of similar value, was burned 2 years before you were born. I did my best to dissuade your grandmother from taking such drastic actions, but she said, "My dear Mr. Lamb, no one else shall play my music now, that I know that I shall never be able to play the piano again." There were tears in her eyes, and he blew his nose loudly to hide his emotion. "Until after you were born, I was the only person except her doctor who knew she was suffering from inoperable cancer. It had already spread from her breast to her right arm. Jenny Marshall was not only a great musician, she was a very heroic woman. Thank you for convincing me that she is still alive." Okay, that was chapter 1 of part 2. I finished this here. It's Monday morning, the 24th of July, 2023.